Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very last session of ITR. The reading for today was chapter 12 on debating. We hope you've read it. At this point, there's something I'd like to say. We have enjoyed writing these chapters, painful as it was, and we got to learn much from the process. And we hope that you have also got, it's contributed to something in your learning as well. Okay, so today, here is what we are planning to do. We'll begin with some general comments about the course. What makes it different? We'll then go back to something that we've been emphasizing throughout the course, namely the transdisciplinary perspective of knowledge, and embedded in it, the need for transdisciplinary concepts and abilities. After that, we'll do a very, very brief recap of what went into the reading for this week, and then move on to your questions. Now, today, if there are any questions from you that we don't finish addressing by 8 o'clock, we'll go beyond that 1 hour duration till 8:30 or 8:45, whichever, as needed, and try to go through all the questions that you post. Okay, so ready? Let's begin. As I said, first some comments about the course, Introduction to Research. Now, when as educators, we design the curriculum for a course, or for that matter, for a whole educational program, it is important to engage with 3 fundamental aspects of the curriculum, which are closely related to one another. So you could think of this as 3 aspects, these 3 aspects as the what, the why, and the how of the course or the program. The what is the educational goals or the learning outcomes of the course. We have to ask, what learning outcomes are we aiming at through, for instance, for ITR, what are we aiming at through the readings and through the weekly online sessions? The why has to do with the educational philosophy underlying the goals. Okay, that's how they're connected. And this has to do with the value system that shapes what we choose as our goals. Why are we doing what we are doing? And of course, the how has to do with the implementation, the pedagogy. What instrumental means do we adopt, successfully or unsuccessfully, to achieve the goals that we have? So what are the educational goals of ITR? Let's look at that. The course itself has 2 broad goals. It seeks to help learners develop a broad yet in-depth understanding of the core aspects of research. Not only the data gathering part, but also interpreting the data within a theory, constructing theories, justifying claims, going into the validity of arguments, and critical thinking and critical reading of research articles. So that is one of the goals of the course. And the other is, a second one is research abilities that cut across all domains of research at a transdisciplinary level. Now that's the course. The readings focus on the art and craft of theory construction, and in that, the observational research in science is brought under the umbrella of theory construction. Now, you might ask why we didn't say this at the beginning of the course, which is how it is typically done. But had we said this at the beginning, chances are that at least some of you wouldn't have understood what we were talking about. But now that you've had some experience of what we mean by the words we use in the sessions and the readings, we hope you can see at least roughly what the course was aiming at. Okay. At this point, we'd like to make a minor detour to place the course in context. Now, the books and university courses that we've come across, which are titled research methods or research methodology, seem to have two common characteristics. One is their focus. They discuss ways of gathering and processing data, for example, statistics, experimental methods, fieldwork, etc., etc. But one thing we've noticed is that none of the courses or the books we have come across, at least, under these titles, say anything about methods of theoretical research. So that's one of the two characteristics. And the other characteristic of all these courses and books and so on is that they're specific to a given domain of research. So you will find things on qualitative and quantitative methods in a particular subject, or experimental protocols in a particular discipline or subdiscipline, and so on. Okay, in ITR, our focus has been on inquiry and research abilities. And in terms of coverage, we've tried to present the course, of course, given all the limitations of time and of the online mode and so on, we've tried to present it such that it would be relevant for anyone interested in research, regardless of the mode of research or the domain of research, whether it is understanding-oriented or usefulness-oriented, and so on. Okay, so juxtaposing those two brings us to the question, what are the attributes that make ITR different from prototypical courses on research? Well, you have 4 attributes on the screen. There's the focus on the abilities of inquiry and research, which at the same time also involve an understanding of the concepts that are needed to support that the abilities. The second feature is the transdisciplinarity of those abilities and concepts. Third, their integration, the weaving together of the abilities and concepts. And the fourth is we've tried to extend that to abilities and concepts of theory construction, specifically that. Okay, so that was by way of pointing out some features of the course. We should now go on to part 2 of the 3-part plan. It has to do with transdisciplinarity, something that we've talked about many times in the course. And it also is about transdisciplinarisation, which is a process that feeds into learning and also into research, and has quite an impact on not just the development of individual knowledge, but also the evolution of collective knowledge. Okay, so for part 2, Mo, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, actually, I want to place this whole idea of transdisciplinarity in the context of academic knowledge as a whole, not any particular disciplines, but academic knowledge as a whole. And for that, I would like to go back to the word philosophy as it was used in ancient times. So in Greek, philosophia was love of knowledge, a systematic investigation. It included all the branches of knowledge that we now know: mathematics, science, philosophy, all humanities, everything. And there is a corresponding word in the ancient Indian systems, shastra. Shastra doesn't mean science. It means, again, branch of shastra means shastra. When you say something like Vastu Shastra, Rasa, different kinds of shastras, Tarka Shastra, and so on, it means a particular branch of knowledge, shastra, when used as a suffix. So then it is the same as ology, like in philology, phonology, biology. Ology simply means a branch of knowledge. So what shastra means then is, again, the same as philosophy in the Greek counterpart. It means simply knowledge. the word philosophy now does not mean the same thing. It means philosophy as distinct from mathematics, as distinct from the sciences, as distinct from history, as distinct from sociology. It has become extremely narrow. This was not the original meaning of the word philosophy. This was not the original meaning of the word Shastra. It was just one thing. So our attempt is to give you a brief sense of what Shastra ought to be, or philosophy ought to be in the original sense of the words. Okay, we can call them philosophy A and philosophy B. Philosophy A is knowledge as a whole. Philosophy B is what is taught as philosophy as a subject. Our goal has been philosophy A. So if you put it that way, then philosophy A is the same as transdisciplinary inquiry and research. So that is what we have been doing, but don't associate the word philosophy with the subject called philosophy taught in university courses. Okay, that's one thing. Now, what does it mean to say transdisciplinarization? It means taking a discipline-specific or a local concept and raising it to the level of knowledge as a whole. So we have mentioned this a few times. Atomic structure is specific to physics, but when you transdisciplinarize it, structure is something that cuts across all forms of knowledge. So take the word homology, which is a very specific concept in biology that refers to the parallels in anatomical or functional structure in biological forms, but you can transdisciplinarize it to apply to all forms of knowledge. So geometry internal concepts, point, line, shape, and space are specific to Euclidean geometry in the way it is presented in school subjects. But you could talk about point, line, and shape, and space, and so on for all subjects. Then you have transdisciplinarizing it. The moment you move from line in geometry to, let us say, linear correlation, then you have moved away from that notion to a higher level. The same way I have mentioned structure, function, category, unit, which are all, you can think about it as in biology, but you can also talk about structure, function, category, unit across subjects. You can talk about mathematical proof and mathematical theory, but when you talk about proof and theory in academic knowledge, you have moved from mathematics to knowledge as a whole. That is what we mean by transdisciplinarization. And this transdisciplinarization applies not only across disciplines, but also across different knowledges. So, for example, Indian philosophy versus Greek philosophy, you see what is common to them and abstract that up. That also becomes transdisciplinarization, which happens across time, across cultures, across space. All these are instances of transdisciplinarization. Okay. So I hope that gives you a sense of what we have been aiming at in this course. We also would like actually you to consider the possibility of looking at evolution of knowledge from these concepts. How did the concepts of proof evolve from ancient times to the modern times? How did the concept of knowledge evolve? Okay. This is a very interesting pursuit, and I hope that you will continue asking these questions after the course. Tara, do you want to go on to the next?
Yeah. And this is an exercise. You already have it on screen. So reflect for a moment on what we've said so far today, and especially today, and try to think of your own answers. Answer them to yourself. You don't have to tell anyone. Answers to two questions. One is, what transdisciplinary concepts and transdisciplinary inquiry abilities did you begin to learn in this course? Yeah. And the other is, have the seeds of the ability for transdisciplinarization begun to sprout in your mind? Because that's a very exciting thing for it to happen. Okay, perhaps this reflection can continue. You can do this on your own later. By the way, if you want the questions, They are in a document. So we've put together the slides for today's, from today in a file, which you will receive at the end of this session. And it's already also available on the web, okay, where all the course materials are. So shall we go on then to part 3 of today's session? It's a very brief, very brief recap of chapter 12. Mo, you want to do that?
Okay, I'll do that. So remember that we started with reasoning. In fact, we started with reasoning right from the very beginning, reasoning as one of the elements of research. But then we went into it in greater detail when we came to, let's say,
chapter 6, chapter 8, sorry.
6,
chapter
7,
8.
etc. But there were two chapters which were specifically devoted to reasoning. That were
8 and 9. 8 and 9.
9 and 10, actually. Oh, reasoning, and then we went on to logic, right?
Yes, yeah.
And then we went to argument, critical thinking, debating. So this is the progress from reasoning to logic to argument to critical thinking to debating. Debating is part 12. So let me say something about debating and arguing. So when we are asked, what is the justification for the position you're holding? The answer is justification. Okay, this is the same as proof. So one person proves that something is true, or some proposition is true, and somebody else in the community proves that that's exactly the same thing is false. So you are actually, somebody is affirming something and the other person is denying it. They are logically contradictory. Okay, so debating is a way of dealing with those situations when two parties, two individuals or two groups hold logically contradictory positions. So if one person holds the view that the earth is flat and the other person holds the view that earth is not flat, it's important that the not is very important. Logically contradictory means X is true, X is not true. That negation of the other position is the crucial part. That is when logical contradictions happen. When two positions are in conflict, but at the same time, there is justification for both. Remember that when there is sound justification for a position, you must accept it. But what happens when there is sound justification for both positions? That some proposition is true and same proposition is not true. There is a logical contradiction. Debating happens when there is such a logical contradiction between the justifications, the conclusions offered by one party as opposed to another party. It is not simply a matter of opinions. I mean, disagreements, yes, but there is something more than that. If you want to resolve that kind of conflict, when there are two rationally justified positions side by side, what do? Well, that is when we engage in defeasible reasoning. We introduced this in chapter 10, defeasible reasoning. Okay, so there is inquirer X claiming some conclusion C and gives a rational justification, and Y claims the opposite of not C. Then we engage in defeasible reasoning, also called non-monotonic reasoning. That we know that this mode of reasoning of non-monotonic reasoning is not worked out in great detail, but we just want you to know that such a kind of logic exists. But so when the premises of two parties are put together, you get a logical contradiction that X is true and X is not true. When that happens, defeasible reasoning comes in and removes one of these, gives you a non-contradictory conclusion. And this is extremely important for debating. Right? And this, interestingly, this was practiced in Tarkashastra, early Indian logic, in Tibetan Buddhist logic, and so on. This was quite popular in the early days of knowledge in India. In fact, in debating, is very common in all vibrant cultures. Okay, so there is something that we would like to tell you. Tara, you want to tell them the story?
Yeah, I'll read the story. It's there on the screen. Yeah. You can just follow it as I read. Nearly 3 centuries ago, on the 21st of February, 1824, to be precise, A mathematician and Orientalist by the name of H.T. Colebrook gave a talk at the Royal Asiatic Society in England. His talk was on cognition, epistemology, and logic in ancient India. It was based on his study of a treatise called Nyaya Sutras, attributed to an Indian philosopher called Akshapada Gautama, who may have lived somewhere between the 16th century BCE and the 6th century BCE and the 2nd century of the Christian era. Okay, now Colebrook's study of the text showed for the first time that the documented body of academic knowledge called Shastras in Sanskrit had, in the words of Jonathan Ganeri, there's a reference given to that work in the handout that is posted. And Ganeri talks about the sophisticated discussions of the categories of being, of varieties of cause, of space and time, of the nature of proof, of sensation, and of functions of the mind. So, what's the point of telling this story? It is to get, for us and for you, to get a sense of the breadth and depth of research and the evolution of academic knowledge, of research, and of academic culture across the centuries and across regions of the world, without battles about East and West and North and South and all of that. Okay. All right, I think that's about all that we had for today to say. And actually about to say in the academic sphere. But before we go on to your questions, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge a whole bunch of people, given that this is the end of the course. Let me begin with you, those of you who signed up for the course and have stuck with it till now. We hope it was worth it for you. We'd also like to thank family and friends who gave us valuable feedback at very short notice on the readings that we've been sending you each week. They know who they are, so I won't name them. But there is one person I must mention by name for the extremely valuable feedback we've had from him. And this is Dr. Sutirth Day from IISER Pune. Then, of course, there is the ThinQ team, all of you who have helped both on screen and behind the scenes. Without the help from the ThinQ team, we would not have been able to pull off this course. Again, I'd like to mention two names in particular. You've all met them on screen, Aditi and Rashmi, who have put in a lot of effort, not just effort, but also a lot of thought into the course. And more than that, have been a source of enthusiasm and encouragement for us. So thanks, everyone. Mo, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I resonate to exactly what you say. I have nothing further. Precisely the same gratitude for all of you, the participants, the people who gave us feedback. And there are also lots of others who have given us feedback we haven't mentioned by name, and also run this course, actually.
Yeah, okay. So before we take your questions, there's something that Aditi wanted to say. Aditi, you want to?
Yes. Like Tara mentioned, thank you everyone for joining and sticking with the course. If you found any of this valuable, do consider subscribing to ThinQ's YouTube channel. We have a lot of things planned for the upcoming months, which if you'd like to receive updates from, please subscribe. And you must have also heard about the annual course that we offer called Inquiry and Integration in Education. This is just a reminder that applications for the course are open till May 1st. And if you found this course valuable and would like to engage with the facilitators and a peer group in a more detailed manner, and also engage with a more, I would say, diverse peer group, and engage more actively to develop your inquiry abilities, do consider joining the course. The details are available in the description and on our website. With that, I think we're good to begin with the questions. Please post your questions in the chat. Right now, I'll go to the question that Garvit has asked us. Don't we also combine logically contradictory conclusions in some cases? Like we combine the notion of light as a particle and light as a wave.
That actually doesn't have to be logically contradictory.
Yeah.
We initially thought, I mean, in the 19th century science, there was this idea it was logically contradictory. If you formulate that as light is a wave, not a particle, and light is a particle, not a wave, then of course they are logically contradictory. It cannot be both. But the insight that quantum mechanics gave us was that light is really neither a wave nor a particle, but under certain conditions it behaves like a wave, under certain other conditions it behaves like a particle. That is not logically contradictory, okay? Under certain experimental conditions it behaves like a particle, under certain other experimental conditions it behaves like a wave. Now this is like saying, suppose you take a Coke can, and I wish I had a Coke can here. Oh, okay, something like this. What you see here, is a circle. But if you hold it differently, now you see a rectangle. This object that I'm holding is neither a rectangle nor a circle. It's a cylinder. And the idea was that, light is like that. It behaves, it has different, depending upon how you look at it, there are two different things, but the thing that you're holding is neither a light, neither a particle, nor a wave. So there's no contradiction. The contradiction is resolved.
Yeah, and had the contradiction not been resolved, then physicists would have been very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah, as they are actually right now uncomfortable in terms of the logical contradiction between relativity and quantum mechanics. There are problems, and everybody's worried about that. But nobody has been able to solve it. The point is not that logical contradictions do not exist at all. They do. But when you find the logical contradiction, you get extremely uncomfortable. You don't, say, okay, that's all right, doesn't matter. No. It should make you very uncomfortable.
Yeah, and one of the abilities that we've been talking about is the ability to recognize logical contradictions.
Yeah. Actually, Garvit has a follow-up question. He asks, so we modify statements to remove the contradictory element?
But there should be evidence for it. Right. You can't simply modify it in any way you like.
Yeah.
We should show that the modified version is better, which is what quantum mechanics showed.
It's not removing the contradictory element, but resolving the conflict.
Yeah. In some cases, it's bad formulation. For example, when you ask, is it nature or is it nurture? That is a badly formulated question, because it can be both. When you say, is it nature or is it nurture, you're assuming that it can be only one of those. But that assumption is faulty. It can be both. So the question ought to be, how much of it is nature and how much of it is nurture? That's the meaning of a question to ask.
Okay, so shall we move on to Anjali's question here?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Some debates in society arise from fundamentally different value system. Example, the pro-choice and pro-life debates with regard to abortion.
Yeah.
How does let me just bring it back. How does something like defeasible reasoning sort out such debates without undermining either of their fundamental values?
Yeah. In this case, I think it is long before we come to defeasible reasoning, we should state what we mean by, let's say, a person. The pro-life people say a person should not be killed. What does it mean to say person? For example, when you exist as a unicellular organism in your mother's womb, are you a person? So this is a matter of conceptual inquiry, okay? And if you say something like the unicellular organism that exists in your mother's womb is a person, then of course you have a problem with killing bacteria. So you need a whole ethical theory, you need clear definitions. The battle between pro-life and abortion is a muddle-headed battle. It's almost like a political battle. It is not an academic battle. So you need to clean up all the mess before you can begin. And you should also agree on the premises. So until we have, a well-educated community, that debate is not possible. Right now, we can only shout at each other. Shouting at each other is not debating.
So if I can just summarize that, to come to a resolution in a question of this kind, first of all, we have to be clear about the value system. Second, we have to be clear about the definitions in what we are looking at. Define things, and there can be a debate only if we have shared definitions. Otherwise, you cannot have a debate. And I think once you have shared definitions and have communicated each other's value system clearly, there is probably not going to be a debate. And if there is, it would be a rational debate. But right now, what happens with something like this is, I think what Mo was pointing to, is not a debate, but an exchange of opinions. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice distinction to bring out, the distinction between opinions and exchanging rational justifications.
Yeah. There's a Stanford professor, Shelley Bryce Heath, called it exchange of ignorance, not debate. Because I think that I love that phrase, exchange of ignorance.
Yeah, so there's a follow-up from Anjali. What if the debate is in the definition?
You cannot have a debate on the definitions. You have to negotiate. Before you start arguing, you have to negotiate. What are we talking about, etc. That's a matter of negotiation. Then you may have to say, if you assign the meaning X to this term, then these are the conclusions. But if you assign the meaning Y to the same term, then the conclusion is different. This is the kind of debate that you have on whether souls exist or not. It depends upon how you define it. And both parties will have to agree that if we define the soul in a particular manner, they will both agree that soul exists. But if you define it differently, both parties would agree that soul doesn't exist. We gave you a demonstration of that in terms of existence of God. Depending upon the definition, you can prove that God exists or doesn't exist, and both parties would agree.
And at that point, the two parties can decide which they want to choose and agree to disagree, if you wish.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it doesn't have to necessarily be a matter of negotiation, but also about discovering what shared assumptions you may have.
Yeah.
So,
That's
so
what
in conversations,
No, go ahead, Aditi.
In conversations with each other, especially when there's some disagreement, I think we tend to assume that there is a difference in value systems or everything about the value system. But there might be shared assumptions which we may not know of.
Yeah.
Those might serve as a good starting point.
And that is where conceptual inquiry becomes really valuable.
Yeah. Conceptual inquiry with extreme rigor and precision, without which this is not possible.
Yep. And actually, Rashmi has a related question. How does one deal with an impasse between the two parties when they can recognize the conflict but not resolve it?
Agree to disagree?
In my experience, those cases are relatively rare. The most common cases for disagreement or apparent disagreement is simply use of words without understanding their meanings.
So what you say? what you're saying is that that kind of impasse doesn't happen if it's a rational debate, when there is rational justification.
Yeah, it's very rare. Of course, they do happen, but extremely rare. In the public sphere, I have not really seen such cases, unless you have non-negotiable assumptions. So the one case, for example, in religion would be, if your non-negotiable assumption is that Bible is literally true, and if the other party's non-negotiable assumption is that Quran is literally true, then there is a conflict in the non-negotiable assumptions. That will give you an impasse. So if you see logically contradictory positions from these two, we are in trouble. This was the trouble that Galileo experienced when he was arguing against the church. The church assumed that the Bible literally tells you the truth. And Galileo's epistemology was that when it comes to matters of astronomy, experience and reasoning will tell you what is true. These are logically contradictory axioms, and you have to recognize them as such. Given those two axioms which neither party was willing to give up, we are in trouble. And the conflict continues. But those are relatively rare.
Okay, so let's move on to a question from Garvit. When we create the ethics relating to science, do we use some evidences, or are the ethics are just decided without any reason?
We have to negotiate an ethical theory. We haven't actually shown you how to construct an ethical theory such that when we have a community of inquirers, they have a common ethical theory. That will take, we haven't demonstrated how that can be done, but it can be done. And then if we agree upon ethical principles, then we can work backwards to whether or not something is ethically good or ethically bad.
Tell you what, if you're interested in ethical theory, then join IIE.
Yeah, we do a lot of that in IIE, yeah.
Another resource worth checking out is, we did an inquiry webinar on ethics last year. The video is there on our YouTube channel, so you might find that interesting too.
We also have a lengthy document on ethical theory. Is that on the web? It's a pretty kind of unreadable document, but we can try.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. So we have a question from Sriram. Is there a difference between disagreeing and agreeing to disagree?
In my opinion, this phrase "agreeing to disagree" is a cop-out. It simply means I don't want to engage with you. Go away. No, I will not accept that until I have tried my best, and then I see no way in saying. Then instead of saying agreeing to disagree, I would say I don't see a way of resolving that conflict. We have not been successful in spite of the best attempts.
Agreeing to disagree is just a euphemistic way of putting exactly what you said.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I don't like that way of, I don't like euphemisms to begin with. I would like people to say bluntly exactly what they mean.
Okay.
There's another question from Ramesh. So how does one resolve differences in interpretation of statements? One says X means A and another says X means B.
Take both. Take both and pursue the consequences. Don't prioritize one over the other. This is exactly like saying, if you define triangle in such and such ways, then straight angle triangle is impossible. But if you define it in such and such other ways, straight angle triangles do exist. You accept both. There is no conflict here.
So what you're saying is we pursue the consequences of both the statements and
exactly.
See what.
Yeah.
And if you do that, you might come to an agreement on the interpretation, or you might see why you are why you have different interpretations and accept that.
Yeah. So notice there is no logical contradiction between the flat surface geometry, Euclidean flat geometry, and Riemannian spherical geometry. All that they're saying is if you set up such and such axioms, then such and such theorems follow. But if the axioms are different, then the theorems are different. There is no contradiction. Because all that is being said is if you accept such and such other things follow. If you accept some other things, then the consequences will be different. Where is the conflict? It's a relation between your axioms and the conclusions. That's all.
Actually, at this point, I'd also like to point out that we have to keep separate our interpretations on the one hand, interpretations, judgments, and so on, and preferences on the other. And to illustrate the difference, I'd like to tell a very short story. Mo and another colleague of ours, this was several years ago, disagreed about a movie. We had watched a movie together, and this colleague really hated the movie. So did I. And Mo thought it was a great movie. And we then decided to sit down and talk through why each one had the judgment they had. And it turned out that our interpretations and our judgments, aesthetic judgments, for example, and so on, they were identical. And yet, so it boiled down to individual preferences.
Yeah.
Right?
I think if I remember right, you're talking about the movie Piano, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
I remember saying, oh, it's such a great movie. Look at the symbolism. It is so heavy. Yes. And he was saying, Terence was saying, oh, look at the symbolism. Heavy. It is so heavy. Therefore, it is bad.
Right.
We agreed on, it is heavy.
Yeah.
Therefore, it is bad. And therefore, it is good kind of stuff.
And so here was something where the judgments were identical, aesthetic judgments. And the intellectual judgments, but the preferences were opposite. And so I think we need to keep that in mind and ask if it's really a difference of preference, individual preference.
To give you another example, the two of us could taste the same dish, and I could say, oh, there is garlic in it, therefore it is bad. And you might say, oh, there is garlic in it, therefore it is good. Whether you like or dislike garlic is not a matter of facts of nature. You're talking about your autobiography.
That's right. Okay. Yeah. Moving on. We have a question from Tarun. And he asks, how can topics of disagreement be found or identified? If I understand the question correctly, how can we convert a topic, say perhaps found in classroom textbooks, to create the possibility of a debate?
That takes, we do this on almost with every textbook, every course. That comes from a little bit of experience. I don't know how to answer that question really. It's just that when you practice this, it becomes obvious. That's all I can say. Yeah. It's like saying, okay, one analogy could be this, the conversation that Tara and I had this morning. If you are a painter, you begin to see highlights everywhere that other people may not see. Okay, I have lots of experience in painting, so as soon as I look at a face, I see these highlights almost automatically. But somebody who is not trained in painting may not. Highlight means some shining things. If you look at my face, you should be able to see, oops, here. Do you see that thing? That is a highlight. Can you see the highlight on my nose? Right. Any object, unless it is absolutely flat and boring, will have highlights. And you have to learn to see that. You should also learn to see color differences in a shadow. Again, these come from experience. And detecting logical contradictions at a certain point is a matter of experience. The more experience you have, you begin to see contradictions where other people didn't see them.
Also, it's not a matter of going looking for them. Sometimes they have to hit you, and if they do, you're lucky. So
just to add to that, I think one part of one way of finding it, at least this has worked for me, is not taking everything you read, say in a textbook, for granted, but by being slightly skeptical and asking questions where you think the The justification provided for that statement is not complete. And that might be one place to begin.
Yeah, you're right. I remember quite often students, when they intuitively detect a logical contradiction, they think they don't understand it. It's their fault. They don't have the courage to say the textbook writer is contradicting himself. That's very difficult for them. So I remember, was it 6th grade or 7th grade students who brought this to our attention about the mushroom case. We have discussed this. Microorganisms are invisible to the naked eye. Fungi are microorganisms, and mushrooms are fungi. Therefore, there's a logical contradiction. And the student said, we don't understand this. The student should have said, the textbook writer is saying something that is contradictory to our experience. The textbook writer is muddle-headed. This is what a mature person should say. I mean, not being arrogant. So this is the distinction between a student and somebody who has learned to stand on his feet or her feet. From the transition from the student to researcher is really the ability to say that the textbook is wrong, the ability to say that your supervisor is wrong, the ability to say that your academic community that you belong to, that community is wrong. That requires some degree of courage. But that is when research begins, with that courage. Of course, under certain conditions, if you have that courage, you might be crucified. That's a different thing.
All right. It's time to move on to the next question.
Anjali has a question from reading. Mechanistic worldview considers causation, which has no place in scientific inquiry. Does causation have any place in other realms of rational inquiry? If yes, in what capacity?
I don't think mechanistic philosophy considers causation has no place. This is a little complicated question. I would say something like the mathematics and logical formalisms have not incorporated causation into the symbolic language so far. That is beginning only just now. Maybe it's about 20, 30, 25 years old. So that's a matter of formalisms for causation. That is only beginning to appear. The mechanistic philosophy is really saying X can cause something on Y only if those two things are in contact. That is what mechanistic philosophy is saying. So it's like livers and, like, for example, the clockwork. The two things have to be in contact. Otherwise, you cannot have causation. Or take billiard balls. One billiard ball cannot make the other ball move unless they come into collision or something to that effect. That view changed around the beginning of 20th century. Because actually, even before that, Newton had this problem about how gravity affects the sun's gravity affecting the earth. The sun is not in contact with the earth, and yet there seems to be a causal relation between the sun's mass and the earth's mass. And Newton didn't quite know how to deal with that, but then his formal laws did not have causation built into the laws, so he was okay. So he was saying, I'm not saying anything about causation, I'm simply saying this is how my theory would describe it. But that so-called action at distance that Newton was struggling with between the sun and the earth and stuff like that changed when Einstein came to the scene. Einstein also kind of subscribed to that view, no action at distance or no action beyond the speed of light and so on. Now I'm getting into all kinds of complicated philosophical problems of quantum mechanics and so on, so I will not go into that. Causation is still a very problematic notion, especially when you come to the quantum world, when you have ideas like backwards causation. The present action has an effect on the past. This is weird stuff, but quantum mechanics is full of weird stuff. So let's not get into that.
All right. Okay, moving on to the next question. There's one from Sushant who asks, can there be an aesthetic judgment which can go beyond personal preferences? And what are the ways to have such an aesthetic judgment? Let's
take a classic, classic judgment, apaswara in Carnatic music or Indian music in general. I don't know if the apaswara is the same in Hindustani and Carnatic. Probably yes.
Right? Yes.
Yeah, it's a kind of some discomfort when you hear two notes side by side. But what the Indian classical music perceives as apaswara need not be apaswara in Chinese opera or Japanese singing. In fact, I still find it very difficult to hear Chinese opera because it kind of, for me, it disturbs my ears because I'm used to Indian classical music. When I heard Beethoven for the first time, I just heard noise. It took me several years of listening to, beginning with Mozart and then gradually to various other kinds of music, to then finally begin to hear the music in Beethoven. And even today, there are lots of types of music where I hear only noise. Heavy metal, for example, is not music for me. It grates on my ears. But this is a matter of getting used to a certain aesthetic culture. Within that aesthetic culture, given those value systems of a given aesthetic culture, everybody agrees, yes. So this same thing about rhythm is much easier. It is, I think, much more common across cultures. The beat. So whether you are an African drummer or tabla player or some other percussionist, they seem to have a common aesthetics.
Yeah, so to summarize that, you're asking, can aesthetic judgment go beyond personal preference? Yes, it can. And what are the ways to have it? It is by expanding your, your comfort zone, whether it be in music or in painting or in dance or whatever, any aesthetic area.
Yeah.
Now, beyond all that, will there still be personal preferences? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we are it's perfectly legitimate to have personal preferences, except you don't debate about them.
No. Yeah? So there was a dance performance where Tara and I walked out. We couldn't bear it because we thought it was like what we call Angusuddhi was missing. We will not mention who the dancer was, but the dancer is adored by some members of my own family.
All right.
That happens.
We have another question from Tarun. Is Socratic debate different than the debate for understanding?
The so-called Socratic debate is not debate. It's a very carefully choreographed,
orchestrated,
bulldozing somebody. Socrates did not practice Socrates questioning, is what I would say. But I will not, it's kind of difficult to explain what Socrates was actually doing. We can do that maybe it's, some other time through emails or something like that. It's difficult to articulate it here in 2 minutes, because you have to take actual examples of Socratic conversations.
So from what I understand, you're saying that Socratic debate is not debate, according to our definition of debate.
Yeah, because he would talk to somebody who is naive, and he would ask questions like, "This is such and such, don't you think?" And the other person says, "Yes." Doesn't have a chance to think, and then of course the guy is in trouble.
Right.
So occasionally I also do that. I must confess. That's not debating.
Right. Okay. Happy to see you admit that.
Bamboozling.
Yeah. All right. We have a question from Pankaj on preference. How can we identify our preference in making meaning of evidence? So, for instance, one may not find evidence of God, but still choose to believe in God. And as a follow-up to that, does this mean ignoring evidence kills our inquiry ability and our judgments?
It's perfectly okay to accept something even if we don't have rational justification for it. But the important part is, when there is rational justification for the opposite, then holding on to that belief is irrational. Okay? So there might be many positions on God which I find there is no evidence for it or evidence against it. So take, for example, the debate, so-called debate, disagreement between Advaita and Dvaita. Advaita believes reality is only one and everything is a manifestation of that one reality. Dvaita believes there are two things. So, for example, there is a Purusha and a Prakriti, and the reality is a consequence of the interaction between these two. I don't think there is any way of resolving this conflict through debating, and I don't think there is any evidence against it, any of these positions or for these positions. So it's your personal preference completely, right? But when you say there is a creator God who is omnipotent, omnipresent, and ethically, paragon of ethics, all that stuff, then there are problems. There is irrationality there. Otherwise, it's okay. So the important part is to distinguish between beliefs for which you don't have any evidence for or against. You're free to choose, as opposed to beliefs for which there is evidence against those beliefs. That's very different.
And also, it's important to recognize a belief, that you have a belief that doesn't have rational justification.
Yeah.
And it's perfectly, we all have those.
Yeah. There are also cases for which there is no rational justification in a given paradigm of knowledge, but there is rational justification for a slightly different paradigm. A classic example would be Foucault theorem is one. Okay. The Foucault theorem says, this was discovered more than 100 years ago, that you take any map, country map or whatever, and you have the condition which says you must color it such that no two adjacent countries have the same color. Okay. It turns out that there exist maps for which you need 4 colors. That's easy to show. But nobody was able to, for more than 100 years, nobody was able to come up with a single map that required more than 4 colors. So all the mathematicians believed that the Foucault theorem, that you don't need more than 4, you need at least 4, but not more than 4, was true. This was well known. But nobody could prove it. So if you asked a mathematician, is it true? They would say, yes, I am convinced it is true, but I cannot prove it. Because it can be proved through scientific inquiry, not through mathematical inquiry. The games are different. So within mathematical inquiry, there is no proof. Within scientific inquiry, there is proof. The same thing applies to Goldbach's conjecture. You can look it up on the web, Goldbach. Yeah. You can find the conjecture in Wikipedia. Nobody till now has been able to prove it. But everybody believes it is true. But if you ask a mathematician, is there proof in it? They would say, no proof in mathematics. But if you use the scientific mode of inquiry, the inductive reasoning, yes, it is true. So it depends upon the kind of epistemology that you use.
Okay. We have a couple of questions from Sobi. Let me just bring that up. Why and how are physicists removing causation from physics? And I'll just bring up the other one.
I don't think physicists are removing causation. You see, causation has been in the physicist's intuition all the way from beginning. Okay, so there is a sense in which Newton believed that sun's gravity causes the Earth to go around the sun. That's his conceptual understanding of his own theory. So that exists in science as far as the concepts are concerned. But when it comes to the actual equations, if you look at the gravitational law or the laws of motion, there is no cause anywhere in the equations. So there's a conflict between your intuitive understanding of gravity and movement and your formal understanding. And this was this that made Russell say physics has no place for causation. But Russell was really saying the equations that physicists postulate do not have causation. So they seem to have this intuition there is causation, but that intuition has no place in the equations. So initially Russell said, so we don't need causation in science. And Russell changed his mind and said, we do need causation, but it's a different concept of causation, and we don't know what it means. So we really don't understand causation.
So this is where we made a distinction between, I think we had this in fairly great detail in one of the chapters, the difference between the conceptual and the formal aspects of knowledge, where causation is perfectly okay in the conceptual aspect, whereas it's not built into the formal aspect. Right? There is no formalism for it. So that's the...
And causation, incidentally, is beginning to get back into physics, even in terms of theoretical, formalisms. There is a causal set theory, for example, that some physicists are developing. You can do a Google search or a YouTube search and find out about those things.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Another one from Sobi, that's what is the aim of physics then? Isn't it to understand why things behave the way they do, or is it simply to predict nature without caring for causations?
You see, the aim of physics is a little complicated matter. If you say, what is the aim of those who call themselves physicists? Then there are some physicists who say, we just want to predict. We don't know how to understand nature. And there are other physicists who say prediction is not sufficient. We want to understand it. We want to explain it. So there's a tug of war between these two groups of physicists. There was a time after the atom bomb, nuclear bomb explosion, when all the quantum mechanics people got together in a conference. And the topic of the conference was, quantum mechanics appears to predict experimental results accurately. It's a miracle, no question. But nobody understands it. I mean, the people who invented quantum mechanics didn't understand it. So some physicists, like David Bohm, for example, felt there is something radically wrong. We don't understand it, therefore we need to think about it. And we need to have something that we can understand, something that can explain, not merely predict. Other physicists, Niels Bohr, for example, said, look, all we can do is to provide these mathematical equations. We don't know what else to do. So let's be satisfied with that. And there was an obvious conflict between the Bohm type people and the Niels Bohr type people. And that conflict continues between the two groups of physicists.
All right. We have a question from Garvit, which he asked early on when we were discussing about the difference between courage and arrogance. He asked, how do you distinguish between the two?
Tara, can you tell me whether I'm arrogant or courageous? I don't know.
No, I won't try to do that. But for me, the difference is between whether what you're saying is pointing at you, whether you are at the center of things, or what is happening is at the center of things. If you put yourself at the center of things, you're being arrogant, is how I see it.
Yeah.
Is all I can say. Yeah, and you can. I don't think you can ever judge somebody else's act as arrogant or courageous. You can only judge your own act as arrogant or courageous.
Let me tell you two stories. One is my own story. When I was a first-year PhD student, I was reading something that Chomsky had written, and I detected an incorrect prediction and a contradiction in something that Chomsky had written. My immediate reaction was, there is a problem. How can... And I thought my first reaction was Chomsky was wrong. And then there was my heart telling me, how can Chomsky, the person who taught you how to think, the person who created linguistics and created a lot of computer science, how can he be wrong and me, just a graduate student, first-year grad student? I couldn't come to say that. I couldn't come to say that Chomsky was wrong. And I discovered later that Chomsky corrected himself later. About 4 weeks later, he corrected that thing. Then I said, oh, so what I detected was right. And that gave me some courage. And then, of course, my entire life at MIT was proving that Chomsky was wrong, or trying to prove that Chomsky was wrong. Either way. In some of the cases, I was right. In some of the cases, I was not right. That's one case where you, as I said, you have to move from studenthood to researcherhood. There is another colleague of mine, Mark Aronoff, who told me this story. He was, in a plane. There was somebody who was sitting next to him. So he started this conversation about, so what do you do for a living, kind of stuff. And he said something like, the guy sitting next to him said, he said, I'm one of the world's foremost mathematicians. My name is such and such. And my friend Aronoff was totally taken aback because the way he said it, it was like, I have a mustache, and you're not arrogant about your having a mustache. You're stating a fact. But what he was saying sounded like extreme conceit. But when he went and checked, lo and behold, yeah, that's exactly, who he was. He was one of the top mathematicians in the world. He was just sitting next to that person. Was it arrogance? No. He looked as though it was arrogance, but he was just stating a fact.
Tara, anything to add to that?
No, just that you should be able to take yourself lightly, and then you won't be arrogant.
Yeah, I wanted to add something actually.
Please
for
do.
me,
Yeah.
For me, it has to do with intellectual humility as well. The ability to say that you're wrong, or to admit that you're wrong, if you have evidence to show that, or if you encountered a rational justification that shows that. If you can do that, perhaps it's not arrogance, it's courage, asking that question in the first place. Related to that, there's a question from Tarun, who asks, why is the culture of debate diminishing?
Why is it diminishing? We don't know.
Yeah.
All we can say is it was thriving from what we understand. It thrived in the ancient Indian culture. It still does in some places. We've been fortunate to have been in places where debate flourishes. And you can actually, tell your teacher, look, in class, you can tell your teacher, no, but that is wrong. And it's taken with perfect equanimity, right? So that, it still does exist, but only in pockets. Why is it diminishing? I don't know.
Because I think I would also say dysfunctional education. So remember that when we set up the linguistics program, a second-year student in the class listened to some argument that you were giving.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes, I do.
Yeah.
It was actually one of the proudest moments in my teaching, when I was giving an argument for something in class, and the second-year undergraduate student said, but Tara, your argument is lame. And she pointed out why, and she was right. So, yes, for me, it was, I had in some sense achieved what I was trying to achieve. So.
I saw Tara's face at that time, and Tara's face, she was beaming with pleasure that a student said this. Imagine some other teacher might have thought, oh, what a horrible student, get out of my class. So it's a teaching culture. I think we are to be blamed for that. Yeah. As educators, we are suppressing dissent. And we are responsible for the death of debating. We are responsible for the death of rational inquiry.
So we have a question from Tarun again, which came in earlier. I think when we were talking about aesthetic judgment and preferences. So Tarun asks, where do the preferences come from? Do these come from belief or value systems?
Preferences are value system. Yeah, it can be different kinds of values, right? Values in terms of taste, aesthetic values, ethical values, epistemic values, all of them. Value is a matter of what you think is important.
Values in sensory perception, right?
Yeah.
What you like to hear, what you like to see, what you like to taste, what you like to smell, these are all preferences. right?
Right. There's a question from Garvit. It's not related to what we've been speaking about, but since we said we'll take all questions today, I think it's worth bringing in. Is there a problem in the method of creating a generalized solution and then inputting values into the generalized solution so that that solution fits reality?
I would
I'm
need
not
an
sure.
example of, I'm not
I
sure.
don't understand it.
Yeah. Um,
Okay.
inputting values. Actually, you start out from, there are things where values don't come into the picture at all. And when they do, they are there right from the beginning to the end, right? So you're not making something fit in some sense. Especially
I wonder
if
if
you
Garvit is asking, using the word value to mean in the sense of value of a variable.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that,
Okay.
Yeah.
that's a very different meaning of the word value.
Yes.
I
We
see.
have to
Yes.
use
I think
Yes.
we were primed
Yeah.
to the other meaning of value because of the
Yeah.
other questions. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So Garvit, you will have to clarify that if that's what you mean.
All right. Okay. Okay. I'll take another question now. Prasad asks, one can have a belief in something which one can't provide any evidence or counter evidence for, right? So, for example, logic in mathematics or something like morality. Or does evidence in this context mean something else?
The first part is easy to answer. You can have a belief which is not contradicted by anything, nor is it supported by anything. That's okay. But logic in mathematics or something like morality. In mathematics, you don't go with logic. Sorry, you don't go by evidence in the sense of something that you observe, but you begin with axioms and definitions. Same thing with logic. You postulate something and then you draw out the logical consequences. Ethics is slightly different because you do have the freedom to choose your ethical axioms, but your ethical axioms must be consistent with your judgments. And if there is a conflict between them, you have to change either your judgments or your ethical axioms. So, for example, if you have the ethical axiom that says that killing any living entity is morally wrong, killing any living entity is morally wrong, then taking antibiotics is morally wrong because you're killing bacteria. And if you believe that viruses are living organisms, you are fighting a battle against viruses, which you should not do. So you have to have some restatement of your ethical principle. So you'll say, well, I will draw a line at, say, unicellular organisms. Anything that is multicellular, you should not kill. Fungus, okay, there are complications there. So this is where the conflict between your ethical axioms and the ethical judgments arise. So it's not as free as science, because in science, if you observe something, you cannot change your observation, whereas you can change your ethical judgments in ethics. So there is a little bit of freedom, which doesn't exist in science. So you don't talk about those things as evidence. Evidence is a word that we use in science, not in mathematics, not in ethics. But then that's a matter of how you use that word, English word, evidence.
Yeah, if I may add, to go back to the reasoning session, we said that science is based on inductive reasoning, and a part of that is until you find evidence to the contrary. And the way I see what we do in mathematics or ethics, we look for counter examples, which don't necessarily have to be evidence, but in the sense that they don't have to be data that's collected or a data point, but rather a premise, which a relationship which is logical more than observational.
Yeah.
Right. Garvit has clarified his question. He says, so for example, creating a theory with n dimensions and then using that to create a three-dimensional theory. So to go back to his question was, is there a problem in the method of creating a generalized solution and then inputting values into the generalized solution so that the solution fits reality? And the example being creating a theory of n dimensions and then using that to create a three-dimensional theory.
I don't see a problem. It's a question of the adequate level of abstraction that you want to pursue, and how you derive a particular theory from a general theory. So suppose you have a general theory of evolution that holds not only for a transdisciplinary theory of evolution that holds for the evolution of the universe, evolution of the biological systems, evolution of human culture, knowledge, etc. The evolution cutting across. But if you're looking at biological evolution, you need to specify it's a specific theory. So you take the general theory and add a few things, and then you get a particular theory. And this is a very common practice in science, in mathematics, and so on. So if that is what you mean when you say take an n-dimensional theory and create a three-dimensional theory, so take even geometry, n-dimensional geometry, and Euclidean geometry is not n-dimensional. At best, it is two-dimensional Euclidean surface geometry or three-dimensional geometry. You could also get one-dimensional geometry if you reduce the number of dimensions, and there is no problem in that, except that when you add these restrictions, your theory gets more and more specialized. That's all.
Yeah, there's a question from Sushant. Can you suggest a reading list to understand science and art of debating?
What do we say? The only work that we know of about the science of debating is the ancient Indian system. Here's a book.
Okay.
Right?
It's called...
This is Tibetan Buddhism.
Okay.
I can't understand most of the things in it because it is, the language is so old.
Yeah, actually, one thing to do might be to Google this and see if you can find something that you relate to, you resonate to, and follow it. This is one place we don't have a reading list for, so.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll take up a last question from Sriram. Often we have high quality mind arguing for the wrong position and low quality mind for the right position. Here we go beyond the issue being debated into intellectual abilities. So how do we deal with such situations?
How do we know whether it is right or wrong?
Yeah.
The only way we can decide whether something is right or wrong is through rational inquiry. So in principle, if God were looking at it, he might say, oh, this high quality mind is arguing for the wrong position, and this low quality mind is arguing for the right position. God would know that, but humans don't have any access to right and wrong other than the epistemic means that we have. So we judge, forget about the quality of minds, look at the justification and decide for yourself. In academic inquiry, we don't ask who is saying what. All that we are asking for is, what is it that is being said and what's justification? Ignore the people. It doesn't matter. Whether it is Einstein, whether it's a school student, it doesn't matter. Of course, there is a problem in the sense that when there is a debate between Einstein and a school child, Einstein has much more information, much more abilities. So Einstein should be a little careful when arguing with the child. It's like a trained boxer fighting with a 10-year-old kid. that is a matter of consideration for novices.
All right. I think with that, we've finished our questions.
Okay, so I guess it's then time for the curtain to fall on the course. But before that happens, looks like Aditi has something to announce, to say. Yeah, Aditi?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the course material will continue to be available on the website. So if at any point you feel like you want to revisit either one of the readings or one of the videos, they will be available on the website, on the course webpage that we have shared with all of you. Like I said earlier, if you found this valuable, do consider telling a friend and who might find this valuable too, and subscribing to the YouTube channel. Uh, if you have any questions, we're available through email, so feel free to shoot them to us. And yes, thank you for joining us, and thank you for all your wonderful questions. I think they've been a great learning opportunity for all of us.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
thank
We'll
you.
see you soon.
And
Thank you.
yeah, we hope we'll see you. And in the meantime, all the best to all of you.
Yeah.
Bye for now.
Bye.